Welcome to this training presentation on the authorization of emergency in-stream work in accordance with Vermont law. My name is Shane Jakewith. I'm a river management scientist with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources Rivers Program. The Rivers Program has long regulated in-stream work throughout Vermont. This video will provide an introduction to Vermont's new processes for authorization of in-stream work conducted to address threats to life and/or property. This presentation may be of interest to a wide range of individuals, particularly those who regularly participate in emergency response and flood recovery. In particular, this presentation is highly relevant to municipal officials, including Select Board members, administrative staff, Highway Department staff, and emergency operations officers. Vermont stream alterations rules recognize and accommodate the reality that flood events may give rise to emergency situations in which flooding and flood-related erosion may threaten life or property, and that addressing these threats often requires rapid implementation of measures which cannot afford to be slowed by standard permitting procedures. Yet at the same time, we must be careful that in mitigating perceived threats, we don't inadvertently set the stage for greater threats to public safety and property damage in the future. And to the greatest extent possible, we don't damage fish and wildlife and their habitats. For instance, a good deal of the in-stream work conducted during the Irene recovery actually created greater vulnerability to erosion damage, and in some cases caused significant damage to fish and wildlife. Prior to 2012, Chapter 41 of Title 10 of state statute provided select boards with the authority to authorize in-stream work to address imminent threats to life and/or property. However, the statutory language didn't contain much detail as to how work would be conducted or reported. During the Irene recovery, a great deal of work was authorized locally with no pathway for communication of these authorizations to state officials. Subsequently, many projects were implemented with no oversight and as a result were not effective, created a greater level of hazard, resulted in damage to natural resources, and created a great deal of public concern. Following the Irene flooding, the 2012 Rivers Bill was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor. The Rivers Bill modifies a pre-existing statute to require that measures authorized by a municipal legislative body or member thereof meet specific reporting requirements and implementation standards as established by the Agency of Natural Resources. The Agency of Natural Resources responded to the Rivers Bill by developing two new processes for authorization of emergency work: the Emergency Protective Measures process and the Next Flood Measures process. Emergency protective measures address threats to life and property that are imminent, with imminent meaning that damage would occur within 72 hours if no action were taken. The Emergency Protective Measures process allows projects to be initiated upon local approval, with review by the Agency of Natural Resources occurring within 24 hours of that approval. Next flood measures are those measures taken where threats to life or property are not imminent, but would be created by a small to moderate and therefore fairly probable flood event within the near future. Consider the hypothetical case where a large flood jeopardizes a structure, but is not so damaging as to create an imminent threat to that structure. If the structure was vulnerable to the extent that another flood, even of small to moderate size, would cause significant damage to the structure, work to mitigate that threat could be authorized under the Next Flood Measure process. Next flood measures are authorized by the Agency of Natural Resources, and municipalities don't play a role. However, it is important for municipalities to understand that where there is no imminent threat and there is time for the project proponent to contact the Rivers Program, the Next Flood Measures process is the more appropriate and certainly the less burdensome alternative for the municipality. The Next Flood Measures process is expedited in the sense that it does not require a public notice period. Once the river management engineer reviews the proposal, he may issue a permit immediately. Before going on, it is important to point out that a distinction is made between improved and unimproved property in both of these processes. Because of the public safety aspect associated with threats to improved property, i.e. habitable structures and infrastructure, next flood and emergency protective measures taken to address threats to improved property do not have to meet the same level of standards as those taken to protect unimproved property. A measure taken to protect unimproved property shall not significantly damage fish life or wildlife, the rights of riparian landowners, nor adversely affect an outstanding resource water. A measure taken to protect improved property shall not, to the greatest extent possible, significantly damage fish life or wildlife, the rights of riparian landowners, nor adversely affect an outstanding resource water. Improved property is defined as a habitable structure and immediately surrounding property, public utility or transportation infrastructure, and infrastructure providing access to a habitable structure. So let's take a closer look at the reporting and authorization process for next flood measures. Again, the next flood measures process is designed to protect against threats to life or property that would be created by a small to moderate flood. Next flood measures are authorized by the Agency of Natural Resources and are expedited in the sense that there are no pre-established review timelines nor public notice periods. Upon review of project information, the river management engineer is able to immediately issue an authorization. While municipalities don't play a role in the next flood measure process, it is important that they are aware of it as the appropriate alternative to address situations where a small to moderate flood would create damage, but there is no threat to life or property occurring within 72 hours in the absence of flooding. The process is fairly straightforward and begins when the Agency of Natural Resources receives a request for authorization from either a public or private entity. The river management engineer will review the proposal and may either request additional information or make a determination as to whether the project can be authorized as a next flood protective measure. If upon review of the proposal, the river management engineer determines that there is no vulnerability to the annual flood, the authorization will be denied. In this case, the applicant could apply for authorization under the General Stream Alterations Permit process. If upon review of the proposal, the river management engineer determines that there is vulnerability to the annual flood, the authorization will be issued and posted on the agency website. As soon as the authorization is issued, the project may proceed. Now let's take a closer look at the Emergency Protective Measures process. Again, the Emergency Protective Measures process is designed to allow rapid implementation of measures to address imminent threats to life or property. In other words, damages which would occur within 72 hours if no action were taken. A project may begin immediately upon local approval without the need for initial authorization from the Agency of Natural Resources. Implementation standards must be met to ensure that the project meets previously stated public safety and fish and wildlife goals, and reporting requirements assure that the project receives appropriate review by the agency, also helping to ensure the project meets intended goals. Reporting requirements also serve to keep all interested parties well informed and result in documentation that will be helpful to the municipality when it comes time to apply for disaster relief. At first look, the process appears fairly complex, but if we break it down, we see that it consists of three fairly simple stages. The first is the municipal approval stage, which begins with a request either from a private citizen or municipal officials for authorization to implement an emergency protective measure. The second stage is the preliminary A&R authorization stage, which begins once the municipality notifies A&R that it has approved an emergency protective measure. The third stage is the final A&R authorization stage, which begins once the project is completed and the municipality submits all required final project documentation information. So it's a three-stage process, beginning with municipal approval, transitioning to preliminary A&R authorization, and finishing with final A&R authorization. Now let's walk through each of the three stages in more detail, beginning with the municipal approval stage. The first step in this stage is the request for authorization. Keep in mind that requests for emergency protective measures can come from either private citizens to protect private property or municipal officials, most likely the highway department, to protect municipal property. The second step in the municipal approval stage is review of the proposed emergency protective measure. In determining whether or not a proposed activity can be authorized, the Select Board or individual board member must make four findings. First is that the proposed project is necessary to mitigate an imminent threat to life or property. Second is that it will not adversely affect public safety. Third is that the project is limited to the minimum amount of work necessary to remove the threat. And fourth is that the proposed project activities are allowed activities as listed in the Stream Alterations Rule. The Stream Alterations Rules establish implementation standards that must be met. A component of the implementation standards defines the activities that may be authorized through the emergency protective measures process. In establishing the list of acceptable activities, an attempt was made to create simple categories of general activities that would capture all the types of work that would be reasonably necessary to address imminent threats to life or property. The categories of activities include the removal of flood-related deposits, stream bed and stream bank fills, temporary stabilization and restoration of infrastructure, and construction of temporary berms. So let's look at the individual categories in more detail, beginning with the removal of flood-related deposits. The definition is the removal of flood-related deposits that would otherwise divert stream flows normally contained in the channel and result in an imminent threat to life or severe damage to property. The implementation standards for removing flood-related deposits are as follows. Channel excavation must restore the pre-flood cross-section or establish a geomorphically stable channel. Temporary windrows must be removed by the project proponent. Channel relocation will only be authorized where necessary to address instability that represents an imminent threat. And excavating new channels that did not exist immediately prior to the flood event requires prior approval from the Secretary and must be consistent with stream alterations performance standards. Now let's turn to the stream bed and stream bank fills category. The definition is given as the placing of fill within the stream channel to align and/or armor the stream bed or stream bank or provide access to critical facilities or infrastructure in order to mitigate an imminent threat to life or severe damage to improved property. The implementation standards for making stream bed or stream bank fills are as follows. Fills must not narrow the bankful width of the channel or create a horizontal bank misalignment, and raising and stabilizing a stream bed shall only be conducted when overseen by a qualified river engineer or their designee, and the work must have prior approval from A&R. Looking next at temporary stabilization or restoration of infrastructure, the definition is given as in-stream construction activities to temporarily stabilize or restore flood-damaged critical infrastructure, including bridges, culverts, roadways, wastewater or water systems, and electronic and telecommunications facilities, in order to address an imminent threat to life or property. Temporary stabilization or restoration of infrastructure will require the implementation of one or more of the other three categories of measures. As such, the implementation standard simply states that the measures taken will meet the implementation requirements for whatever category of activity is utilized. Also, if the stabilization and/or restoration of infrastructure requires fills or installation of structures that encroach into and narrow the bankful width of the stream channel, create an acute horizontal stream bank misalignment, and/or use undersized or otherwise unsuitable materials for stream bank and/or roadway embankment stabilization, these fills or structures shall be temporary, and the final A&R authorization shall include requirements for the permanent repair or replacement of the infrastructure, including a date when any permanent repair or replacement work must be completed. Berms are the linear piles of aggregate or other material placed along the tops of the stream bank to prevent flood flows from spilling into the adjacent river corridor area. The emergency protective measure process recognizes the potential need to construct berms to address imminent threats. However, due to the increased in-channel erosion that berms cause by containing flood flows and their excessive erosive energy within the channel, berms may only be established, constructed, or maintained in a flood hazard area or river corridor where they are necessary to preserve life by preventing stream flows from impinging directly on an improved property. Berms constructed for this purpose shall be considered temporary and shall be removed coincident with the removal of threats to public safety. In summary, upon receiving a request for municipal approval, the Select Board or individual Select Board member must review the proposal and determine if it meets specific conditions. First, is the project necessary to mitigate threats to life or property? Second, will the proposed project activity adversely affect public safety? Third, is the project limited to the minimum amount of work necessary to remove the threat? And fourth, are the proposed activities on the list of allowed emergency protective measure activities? The answers to these four questions determine whether the project can be approved as an emergency protective measure. If the Select Board or individual Select Board member determines that the proposed activity is not necessary to address an imminent threat of damage to life or property, or that it isn't an allowed activity or will not meet the implementation standards, it may deny the request, at which point the applicant may seek an authorization under either the next flood measure or general permit or individual permitting processes. If the Select Board or individual Select Board member makes the required findings and approves the measure, the project may commence, and the town must within 24 hours provide the Agency of Natural Resources with required information including project location, description of the imminent threat, and a description of the authorized activity. It should also be noted that the municipality must notify the regional engineer or the Montpelier Rivers office by phone and either email or the online web form that the Rivers Program has established to receive such notifications. Let's next take a look at the web form that can be used by the municipality to notify A&R of an authorized emergency protective measure. We believe that this will be the easiest means of satisfying the requirement to electronically notify A&R of an emergency protective measure. The address of the form is www.watershedmanagement.vt.gov/contactrivers.htm. Alternatively, you can go to the River Management homepage and use the Contact Rivers web form link. Using your internet search engine to search for Vermont River Management, you will get to the River Management homepage. The first page of the web form indicates that by completing this form, you are complying with statutory requirements to report authorized emergency protective measures. The form has 4 sections. The first, shown here, is the contact information section. The red asterisks indicate required fields. Job title isn't required, but it is helpful for us to know the role of the person submitting the form. The required information includes first name, last name, phone number, and email address. The second section is the project information section, which is where the user enters the 911 address or other location information of the approved measure, the municipality in which the measure will occur, which is required, the watercourse or river name if known, and verification that the Select Board has approved the measure, also a required entry. The third section of the form provides space to describe the imminent threat that the approved emergency protective measure is intended to mitigate. The form provides a list of flood-related threats, and the user can simply check all that apply. The fourth section of the form provides a place to describe the measures that have been approved. The form contains a list of the allowable measures described previously. The user simply indicates which measures were authorized by checking the associated boxes. The fifth section asks whether a river management engineer has been notified by phone and provides a submittal button. In the case that the user intends to enter information for more than one locally authorized emergency protective measure, the Submit and Enter Another Report button is particularly useful because it brings up a new form pre-populated with all of the general municipal and contact information so that the user doesn't have to enter it all again. And that's all there is to providing electronic notification of municipally approved emergency protective measures. Submittal of this form triggers a series of automatic emails. One goes to the engineer, who will then contact the municipality about preliminary authorization. Another automatic email goes to the municipality to serve as documentation that they made the required electronic notification. Another component of the electronic reporting system is the use of the A&R Natural Resources Atlas to document active emergency protective measures. By going to the Atlas at the web address shown here, anybody with internet access can obtain all available information on active emergency protective measures. Our hope is that this online information will improve situational awareness among state and local officials as well as members of the general public. Let's get back to looking at the overall emergency protective measure process. We left off at the end of the first stage where a request for local authorization had been made, reviewed and authorized by the Select Board or individual Select Board member, and the municipality notified A&R of the authorization via the online web form. Once approval of an emergency protective measure is reported to A&R, Stage 2, which is the preliminary A&R authorization stage, begins. The Regional River Management Engineer will review the approval and take one of the following 3 actions. Deny the authorization, require that the project cease until a site visit is made, or issue a preliminary authorization as approved or with conditions. Denial of preliminary authorization would most likely be made on the grounds that there is no imminent threat to life or property. If A&R denies a preliminary authorization, the project will cease as specified by the River Management Engineer, and the project proponent may apply directly to A&R for authorization under the next flood measure or general or individual permit processes. A&R also has the option to take enforcement or compliance actions if necessary. The second option that the River Management Engineer has is to require that the measure cease immediately until a site visit can be made, after which A&R may deny or grant a preliminary authorization. The third option that the River Management Engineer has is to issue a preliminary authorization as authorized by the Select Board or with additional conditions, in which case the project continues to completion. The final step in Stage 2 is submission of the final project documentation. Within 30 days of the project being completed, the municipality must submit the following project documentation to A&R. Copies of all written notifications provided by the municipality to the agency, copies of the preliminary authorization issued by the agency, written and photo documentation that the emergency protective measure meets the implementation standards, a site map showing the approximate project limits, and the types and quantities of material removed and/or fills placed and the methods used to determine quantities. It should be noted that A&R may grant up to an additional 30 calendar days for project documentation to be submitted. It should also be noted that the compilation of this information as provided by the permitting process will also help the public assistance application process when the time comes. Once the project documentation has been submitted by the municipality, the final A&R authorization phase begins. A&R will review the final project documentation to determine whether the project received initial approval by the local select board, received and complies with the preliminary A&R authorization, and is consistent with the standards for implementation provided in the Stream Alterations Rule. If the final authorization is denied, A&R may work with the municipality and the project proponent to bring the project into compliance or take enforcement action if necessary. If final authorization is provided, it will be in the form of a general or individual permit, and A&R will post the authorization and project documentation on its website in compliance with agency public notice requirements. Let's take a moment to look at the public notice requirements that exist at various points throughout the process. The requirements include that notifications, authorizations, and project documentation, as they are issued, be placed in the following locations: on site while the project is being implemented, on file in the town office until a final authorization is provided, and on file with A&R, where they will be posted on an A&R webpage for no less than 90 days after the final authorization is issued. As we've seen, there are a variety of municipal responsibilities throughout the emergency protective measure authorization process. The assignment of these responsibilities will likely vary from municipality to municipality depending on local circumstances. How a municipality decides to assign roles and responsibilities is best left to the municipality. As with all emergency response systems, what is important is that roles and responsibilities are assigned prior to an event so the municipality is prepared to act when the time comes. The following possible arrangement of roles and responsibilities is presented as a starting point for discussion amongst your community officials as how to best organize for the emergency protective measures process. Development of initial project documentation. In the case of threats to public property, this responsibility might be carried out by a select board member, the road foreman, or town emergency officer. In the case of threats to private property, this responsibility might lie with the landowner with the assistance of a select board member, the road foreman, or an emergency officer. Review of the proposal and recommendations to the full select board or individual select board member might be carried out by an individual select board member or the road foreman. Authorization authority lies with the Select Board or individual member. Verbal notification of the local authorization to the Agency of Natural Resources River Management Engineer could be carried out by the road foreman or a Select Board member. Electronic reporting of the Emergency Protective Measure authorization to A&R could be carried out by the town clerk or assistant to the Select Board or town administrator. Posting of the A&R preliminary authorization at the town office and job site could be the responsibility of the town clerk, Select Board member, and/or road foreman. Development of documentation of projects to address threats to public property could be carried out by a Select Board member, the road foreman, a town emergency officer, and town clerk or assistant to the Select Board. Final documentation of projects to address threats to private property could be the responsibility of the landowner with assistance from a municipal official. Submission of final project documentation and recording of final A&R authorization could be handled by the town clerk or assistant to the Select Board. Again, we don't mean to prescribe how municipalities organize their emergency response roles, but we thought it might be helpful to see how we think these roles might be organized. And that completes this overview of the Emergency Protective Measures process. Again, the intent of the process is to facilitate rapid response to imminent threats to life and/or property, while at the same time providing for the appropriate A&R review, technical assistance, and authorization, as well as public notice. As you have just seen, meeting these sometimes conflicting goals does require a process that depends upon a fair amount of municipal involvement. The Rivers Program has attempted to minimize the level of burden created by the Emergency Protective Measure process, but the best way to minimize that burden is to reserve its use for situations where there are true imminent threats. Where imminent threats are not present, the municipality will best be served by directing project proponents to the Rivers Program for authorization under either a next flood measure or general or individual permit process. And that concludes this presentation on the authorization of emergency in-stream work in accordance with Vermont law. Thank you for taking the time to learn about this topic. For more information, you can visit the Rivers Program Stream Alteration Permits webpage, where you will find the Stream Alterations Rule, general and individual permits, a link to this training presentation, a written guide to authorizing emergency protective measures, and technical documents on conducting river management activities in Vermont.